That versus which. A lot of writers use that and which interchangeably. However, they are not actually interchangeable. They serve two separate functions that offer us insights into the differences between a relative or non-essential clause and a restrictive or essential clause. This begs the question, what is the difference? Well, simply put, which introduces what is known as a relative or non-essential clause. And when it's used in this context, there will be a comma before it. That, in contrast, is used to introduce a restrictive or essential clause, and it will not have a comma before it. Let's take a look at a relative clause first. I just watched La La Land. Now that's the specific name of a specific film. We want to add an extra piece of information, so we drop in a comma, which stars Emma Stone. Now here, which stars Emma Stone is related to La La Land, but it is not required. So if we removed the second element and closed the sentence out with a period, that would still work because the sentence does not change in meaning. So therefore, if we do add that extra element, it'll be comma which. Let's say I want to say the same thing, but I've forgotten the name of the film. Now we'll need a restrictive clause. In this case, I might say, I just watched a musical, but I haven't named a specific film. Then I'll add, that stars Emma Stone. Now in this case, that stars Emma Stone restricts which musical I'm talking about. It has to be there. If we were to remove one and simply said, I just watched a musical, the reader would have no clue which musical you're talking about. So in this context, because it's restrictive, we'll use that without a comma, so the reader knows we're restricting the musical. In instances where you're discussing people, places, and times, we'll typically use who, where, and when. The same rules apply. If you introduce a relative clause or a non-essential element, these words will be preceded by a comma, comma who, comma where, comma when. But if they are restrictive, there will be no comma, but simply who, where, and when. For example, I might say, I just met Priyanka Chopra. Specific name, specific person. Comma, who is the star of White Tiger? Now in this case, who is the star of White Tiger is related to Priyanka Chopra, but it's not essential. We have her specific name. So if we were to remove that final item and close it with a period, this still works as a sentence because the reader knows who we're talking about. If I forget her name, I might say, I just met the actress who is the star of White Tiger. Now here you'll see that there is no comma because in this context, who is the star of White Tiger restricts which actress we're talking about. If we were to remove this element and simply said, I just met the actress, the reader would have no clue who we're talking about. So in this case, we need the who without a comma because it is restrictive. The same rule applies when introducing lists of examples with such as or including. If you're introducing a relative or non-essential list, it's comma such as or comma including. But if it's a restrictive or essential element, there will not be a comma before. Example, this zoo features many aquatic birds, comma, such as ducks and geese. Now in this context, ducks and geese are related to the aquatic birds, but if we remove this element, the zoo still has aquatic birds, and that sentence still means the same thing. However, if we were to say birds such as chickens and penguins can't fly, this element is restrictive. We're restricting which birds we talk about. If we remove the restrictive element and we simply said birds can't fly, this does not work because most birds can fly. However, birds such as chickens can't fly. So in this context, we'll use such as without the comma. Key takeaway: consider whether the elements you are adding must be in the sentence to convey the intended meaning of the clause. In instances where they must be there, you have a restrictive or essential element. That means you do not use a comma. However, if they're just adding extra information, then they are relative or non-essential. In this case, you are going to use a comma. And this is the difference between a relative or non-essential clause and a restrictive or essential element.